It was impossible to refute the evidence. Multiple police reports, text messages, images of damages, and even recordings of threats were among the items that you had provided to the authorities. Your statements were taken by the cops with somber nods, which served as a reassurance that they were aware of the potential risk. It was beyond any reasonable doubt that they were aware of the fact that you were a victim who was in desperate need of protection. Despite this, the system collapsed around you at the very moment that you required them the most. For a number of hours, your calls for assistance were not answered. During the processing of the restraining orders, they were suddenly lost. Officers who had previously appeared concerned now became inaccessible to the public. What you failed to recognize at the time was the intricate web of corruption that had ensnared the same individuals who had pledged to defend you. There were connections between your tormentor and the police department, including a cousin who worked there, financial ties to the police union, and regular golf games with the precinct commander. Your requests for assistance were consistently undermined by discussions that were whispered and documents that were destroyed each time you reached out for assistance. After the damage had already been done, the truth was finally revealed. The law enforcement agents who were tasked with ensuring your safety had prioritized their loyalty to their corrupt networks over their role to safeguard you. Your situation was not only ignored, rather, it was purposefully undermined by those working within the exact organization that was supposed to serve as your defense. The truth was known to the court system from the very beginning of the process. You are the one who was hurt. All of the reports that you filed, all of the calls for assistance, and all of the pleadings that you made were irrefutable evidence of your innocence. On the other hand, rather than keeping you safe, they joined forces with those who were working to harm you. Not only was there no incompetence, but there was also no misunderstanding. A choice was made, a deliberate decision to disregard the truth in favor of something that was significantly more valuable to them: power, influence, and the protection of their own lives. The person who tormented you did not simply get lucky. They had the system working in their favor. At the minute that you became a threat to someone who had connections, the balances of justice began to tip against you. The charges that were made against you began to pile up all of a sudden. These accusations included false claims, deceptive reports, and twisted narratives that portrayed you as the aggressor. You were not merely disregarded, rather, you were condemned. The very individuals who were supposed to protect you turned their backs on you and focused their attention on protecting themselves instead. You were able to witness it taking place in real time. Suddenly, cops who had before acknowledged your anguish treated you with a chilly disdain, and you saw as this happened. Your credibility was relentlessly undermined at the same time as your name was dragged through the gutter. When you entered a precinct, you were not greeted with concern. Rather, you were greeted with mistrust. Every attempt you made to defend yourself was deemed to be hysterics, delusion, or even worse, guilt. Your screams for assistance were not simply being ignored by them. Rather, they were making a concerted effort to ensure that no one else heard them either. In this conflict, you were going up against a system that had already decided what it wanted to do. The issue was not about the facts, nor was it about justice. Rather, it was about control. Whenever a powerful individual made the decision that you were a problem, the machine immediately began to operate, putting you out of your mind, destroying your credibility, and ensuring that no matter what evidence you presented, it would never be sufficient. Dear brothers and sisters, may God's peace be with you. Remember this truth: our lives are anchored in His divine plan, beyond worldly concerns. As Scripture says, Give, and it shall be given unto you. Luke 6:38. Like a mighty oak, we stand firm in his strength. Now, you have the opportunity to step into that blessing. When you use the super thank you button and give $100, know that his abundance will return to you 100-fold. They were able to conceal the truth by covering it up with layers upon layers of lies. Your abuser did not need to exercise caution, since they were aware that the system would not hold them accountable for their actions. It was well known to them that every single report that you submitted would be lost, and that every single piece of proof that you presented would be disregarded. You were never expected to come out on top in this game, since it was rigged from the very beginning. But what they failed to take into account was the fact that the truth has a way of coming back to the surface. There is a limit to how long lies can be maintained before they begin to fall apart. It was not blind justice. Rather, it was purchased and sold to whoever offered the highest price. Neither negligence nor ineptitude were the only issues you had to deal with. You faced a computer that was meant to protect its own at whatever cost, and you were up against it. From the time you took the initiative, the system did not only disregard your pain, rather, it became an active player in your demise. Allegations that were not true began to surface. Assertions that were so ridiculous that they ought to have been disregarded right away. However, the very institutions that were supposed to safeguard you instead gave them credibility, which shows that they were successful. The police records were modified in order to distort the truth. Crucial evidence was conveniently removed, and witnesses who could have defended you were silenced through the use of intimidation or pressure. There was no randomness in the corruption. Rather, it was calculated. There was no way that every single piece of the puzzle could have been a coincidence. The officers who had before appeared to have compassion were now repeating the statements made by your adversaries. There was an unexpected agenda on the part of prosecutors who were supposed to be unbiased. Even judges, who are supposed to be the final line of defense against unfairness, turned a blind eye while the system distorted reality in order to fit the narrative that they desired. There were other institutions than the legal system that worked against you. Former allies, as well as members of the media and social circles, started to pull away from one another. You were portrayed as unstable, violent, and even guilty of crimes that you had never done through the use of whisper campaigns. Your situation became much more dire the more you fought back. Your actions were misconstrued, your words were twisted, and every effort that you made to clear your name was used against you. Every time you unearthed more of the truth, they made an even greater effort to conceal it. After you uncovered one of their lies, they developed another one. As soon as you demonstrated that you were innocent, they shifted the goalposts. The pursuit of justice was never the goal. Rather, it was the maintenance of control. It was impossible for those in positions of authority to allow the truth to become public knowledge because, in the event that it did, the entire system would completely collapse under the weight of its own corruption. One thing, however, they failed to take into account. Falsehoods are brittle. Cracks were beginning to appear in the story. Regardless of the number of people that worked against you or how tightly they attempted to control the narrative, they were under the impression that they could manipulate the system indefinitely. Nevertheless, corruption is only effective for as long as no one suspects it. In addition, individuals were beginning to ask the appropriate questions at this point. There was no error, and there was no chain of unfortunate omissions that led to this situation. Betraying you was a deliberate, calculated, and orchestrated act that was carried out by individuals who made clear judgments to do so. Each and every report that went missing, each and every document that was fabricated, and each and every request for assistance that was disregarded. There were actual people who decided to ignore them. Some of them had personal stakes in your misery. For example, a crooked police who owed your abuser a favor, a prosecutor climbing the ranks who was willing to sacrifice your case for political gain, and a judge who had significant financial ties to the exact people you were fighting against. These bureaucrats were not anonymous and faceless individuals. They were powerful individuals, and they had no intention of allowing the truth to get in the way of their goals and aspirations. You're not here by chance. Feel the pull. Tap Join to unlock truth, purpose, and a tribe that gets it. This is more than a membership. It's your calling. It was only necessary for one signature to cause the evidence to be misfiled. With just one word from the appropriate individual, important witnesses might be rendered unavailable. It is possible that a favor that is effectively placed could ensure that an investigation is closed before it ever begins. It was not a case of ineptitude. Rather, it was a network of corruption, with each individual contributing to the network in order to guarantee that justice was never carried out. Then there were those individuals who did not even require a direct incentive to motivate them. Unquestioning allegiance was sufficient for them. In spite of the fact that the evidence was quite incriminating, officers who had spent years working in the system were not going to turn against their employees. The protection of their own careers was more important to them than the protection of the law-abiding citizens. It was more important to maintain the department's reputation than it was to worry for your safety. Your abuser was allowed to walk free, while they did nothing except stand by and do nothing. The most heinous act, however, was committed by those who were aware of the truth but chose to remain silent about it. These were individuals who were aware of the injustice and who saw the proof, but they chose to remain silent because they knew that speaking up would put their own position in jeopardy. These were the individuals that witnessed your suffering and chose to remain silent rather than being honest. When it came to personal vendettas, the legal system became a weapon, not for the sake of achieving justice. Someone intended to destroy you, whether it was a vindictive ex-lover, a bitter rival, or someone with too much power to be opposed, and the system provided them with everything they required to accomplish their goal. They did not only allow it to take place, rather, they were the ones who brought it about. What they failed to recognize was that there is always a trace left behind by corrupt behavior. The more they sought to disguise their tracks, the more they demonstrated how comprehensive the conspiracy was, and holes were beginning to appear in the structure of the conspiracy. Until it stops working, corruption is effective. It appeared for a time that their power was unquestionable. In an effort to shield themselves from the consequences, they hid evidence, silenced witnesses, and distorted the story. However, there is a correlation between hubris and errors, and the more they misused the system, the more sloppy they became. They believed that not only had they covered every track, but they had also wiped every trace and controlled every voice that could have exposed them. However, corruption is a double-edged blade, and at this point, it was working counter to their interests. It was within their own ranks that the rumors first arose. Not everyone was willing to suffer the consequences of the actions of another person. All of the officers had witnessed too much. Even the most trusted allies of the prosecution were quietly severing their ties with them as they began to distance themselves from the situation. According to the investigators, they began to uncover inconsistencies, such as files that did not make sense, witness testimony that contradicted official records, and a trend that indicated something that was much more significant than a case that had been handled improperly. Disputes inside the organization broke out. The same crooked officials who had previously collaborated with one another were now frantically trying to maintain their own safety. When careers and reputations were at stake, loyalty vanished from the equation permanently. They were beginning to backstab one another, deals were being done, and the reality that they had battled so hard to suppress was beginning to emerge among them. Their authority had been founded on a foundation of lies, but lies are notoriously difficult to maintain. After one leak, there were two more. There was one angry insider who turned out to be a crucial leaker. It was just one piece of evidence that could not be refuted that set off a chain reaction that even they were unable to halt. As they made further efforts to manage the repercussions, the situation became even more dire. The general population was keeping an eye on them outside of their system. The information that had been concealed in confidential meetings and files that were then sealed was now being brought into the open. The very same news organizations that had previously disregarded your pleas for assistance were simultaneously conducting their own inquiries. Activists, lawyers, and others seeking the truth who had previously been disregarded as conspiracy theorists were suddenly being taken seriously. They were being crushed under the weight of their own depravity, and there was nothing that they could do to stop it from falling on them. It was the first time that they experienced the same feelings of fear, uncertainty, and helplessness that they had imposed upon you in the past. The system that they had formerly controlled was suddenly turning against them. The end result of their immoral behavior was not merely exposure. Rather, it marked the beginning of their fall from grace. There was more to this than simply you. The corrupt behavior that led to the destruction of your life was not an isolated incident. Rather, it was a fragment of a much larger phenomenon. It became abundantly evident that you were not the first person to be targeted as the system's weaknesses continued to enlarge itself. The same strategies had been used in the past, over and over again, to quiet, punish, and destroy innocent people who stood in the path of those who were in power. Whistleblowers initiated their appearance. Officers who had previously obeyed commands without questioning them were now providing their opinions. The revelation of documents, audio recordings, and classified reports that had been leaked began to surface, portraying an indisputable image of corruption that was deeply embedded in D. It was not only a few unscrupulous prosecutors or a few lousy cops that were responsible for this. It was a whole network, the kind of well-oiled mechanism that was built to protect those who were strong and crush everyone who stood in their way. You didn't stumble here by accident. You were led. If something in your spirit is stirring, don't ignore it. Tap Join to access exclusive content, prophetic insights, and a community of purpose-driven souls. This isn't just a membership. It's your moment of alignment. Step into who you were born to be. Welcome to the Chosen. The same system that had appeared to be unbeatable in the past was now revealed to be what it actually was, a game that was rigged to ensure that those who were guilty were allowed to walk free, while those who were innocent were punished. The delusion of doing justice was completely destroyed. And that was the first time that those who were observing from the outside started to comprehend the reality of the situation. Journalists who conduct investigations, independent watchdogs, and legal experts each began conducting more research. The revelations became more frightening as they proceeded further into the investigation. There were cases that were being unearthed that were disturbingly similar to yours. These cases included victims who had been hushed, perpetrators who had been protected, and evidence that had been purposefully adjusted or destroyed. There was no escape from the pattern. However, the thing that struck them the most was how brazen everything was. Those in positions of authority had never believed that they would be held accountable. Because they had grown so accustomed to getting away with their criminal acts, they had stopped being attentive about where they were going. This arrogance ultimately led to their downfall. They were now frantically trying to get things done. Lawsuits were growing in number. Investigations into the company's internal issues were currently being conducted, and the public was demanding answers. The very same institutions that had previously shielded them were now making an effort to separate themselves from them. And in order to save face, they were throwing their most corrupt members under the bus. It was, however, too late. A web of lies that they had woven for years was beginning to unravel at a rate that was faster than they could contain it. The information that had been kept secret behind closed doors was suddenly being made public for everyone to view right now. This time, there was no way for them to cover up the fact that the system that had failed you was collapsing under the weight of its own level of corruption. They were well aware that the walls were closing in on them. They had done their business in the shadows for many years, under the impression that they were untouchable. This was done in order to serve their own objectives, which included silencing voices, destroying lives, and manipulating the system. On the other hand, corruption is a debt that will never be paid off. At this moment, the exact device that they had been relying on to safeguard themselves was working against them. Investigations conducted within the company that had previously been only exploratory were now leading to actual consequences. On the other hand, officers who had previously dismissed allegations of wrongdoing with a joke were being compelled to quit. It was now being investigated whether or not prosecutors had broken the law in order to serve their own agendas. The judges who participated in the cover-ups were subject to ethical reviews to determine their actions. In addition, those in higher positions, who were the ones who actually controlled the situation, were starting to feel the pressure. The amount of money lost increased. Lawsuits filed by victims, who were individuals just like you, were draining local budgets and exposing years of illegal activity that had been concealed. They were frantic to cut relations with the Dari institutions that had previously protected them, and they were throwing erstwhile partners under the bus in order to prevent catastrophic collapse. The very same legal system that had served as their weapon in the past was now a force that they were unable to exert control over. These individuals continued to come forward with their testimony, which was indisputable. Individuals who had previously been concerned about the possibility of retaliation now saw an opportunity for justice. Those with insider knowledge were making deals and betraying their former co-workers in an effort to escape getting caught in the aftermath of the situation. Attempts to conceal the truth simply served to hasten its dissemination when they were attempted. Reporting on the avalanche of corruption that was being exposed was the only option available to the media, which had hitherto been reluctant to criticize the system. The public's distress increased, and they demanded responsibility. Now, the names of those individuals who had deceived you, who had previously been shielded by the system, were prominently shown in the headlines. Following then, there were legal complications. The very same judges and prosecutors who had previously ignored the mounting evidence against them were now being compelled to accept the evidence. The establishment of grand juries and the filing of criminal charges were both taking place. It became impossible for the institutions that had previously shielded them to continue to disregard the indisputable reality. You were not protected by them in any way. They had opted for corruption rather than impartiality. However, at this point, they were the ones who had nowhere to stay. The consequences that they had believed they could avoid had at long last come up with them, and for the very first time, they were the ones who felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The worst dread that they could possibly have is losing control of the story. Over the course of several years, they oversaw the dissemination of information, stifling the voices of victims, changing evidence, and making certain that their version of events was the only one that was taken into consideration. However, at this point, the truth was escaping their grasp and spreading at a rate that was greater than their capacity to hold it. The more they attempted to stifle it, the more severe the situation became. The feeling of desperation began to creep in. In an effort to save themselves, they made a hasty effort to rewrite history and place blame on a select group of individuals who were used as fronts. Because they were afraid that their names might be next on the list, officers who had before laughed at your misery now whispered in hushed murmurs of fear. The prosecution, who had previously disregarded the evidence, was now giving public statements that were ambiguous, thereby distancing themselves from the cases that they had tainted. It was getting to the point where even their most devoted allies were beginning to plot. They made an attempt to mitigate the damage by issuing comments that were full of hollow promises regarding the reformation of the system. It was, however, too late. They were able to see through the lies. Apologies were not something that the public was interested in. Rather, they wanted accountability. The same citizens who had previously placed their faith in these institutions were now seeking justice, and for the very first time, those in positions of authority were unable to deter them from doing so. The efforts to discredit the individuals who reported wrongdoing came to a disastrous end. Rather than attempting to stifle the truth, they merely succeeded in drawing greater attention to it. An even greater amount of incriminating evidence was discovered by investigative journalists. More lawsuits were brought by attorneys. In front of the precincts and courthouses, demonstrators assembled and demanded resignations and criminal proceedings against those responsible. The depravity that they had carefully concealed for a number of years was now being openly shown for the entire world to see. It was easy to feel their anguish. There was a leak of internal emails. It was revealed that authorities who had previously remained silent were now coming out, so demonstrating the extent to which the corruption extended. The documents that were supposed to remain private and were never intended to be made public are now considered public record. The issue was only made worse by every attempt that was made to contain it. And what is the most unfortunate thing for them? You made it through. You had been buried under a system that was created to break people like you, and they had done all in their power to bring you down and ruin you. Despite this, you continued to stand. Now you were the living proof that they had failed to achieve their goals. They were not just concerned about being exposed, they were also concerned about losing the power that they had exploited for such a long time. It was not justice that they feared. Rather, it was you that threatened them. They had no hopes that you would make it through this. They were under the impression that the weight of their corruption would collapse you, and that their lies would be sufficient to obliterate the truth. Nevertheless, you revealed them rather than breaking them. Your voice became more audible rather than being muffled by the stillness.